I think actually the only difference between business and some nonprofits is what you do with your surplus. And does it go to shareholders or do you reinvest it in purpose and impact?
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. Each episode, join us as we talk with leaders and innovators about building our collective power to drive lasting change in communities across Canada and around the globe. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, for making our podcast possible. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Welcome back to Let's Imagine. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. Canada's economic landscape has shifted dramatically over the past few years. Businesses across the country are navigating inflation, labor shortages, digital transformation, geopolitical uncertainty, including a widening conflict in the Middle East at the time of this recording, and changing consumer expectations. At the same time, growing trade and policy uncertainty, including questions about the future of Canada's trade relationship with the United States, is adding another layer of complexity. And whenever business changes, so does the nonprofit sector. Because the truth is, nonprofits and businesses are deeply connected. Corporate donations, sponsorships, employee volunteering, procurement partnerships, and community investment strategies all shift in response to the economy. The well-being of one influences the other. To help us understand what's happening right now and what lies ahead, we're delighted to be joined by Candace Laing, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Candace is a nationally respected business leader, strategist, and advocate for building resilient organizations, and she has a deep understanding of how economic conditions shape corporate behavior, workplace trends, and community investment. Before joining the Chamber, she held leadership roles in sustainability and stakeholder relations, including responsibility for sustainability strategy and oversight of government and community relations, and she was instrumental in launching ESG efforts in governance. Candace, welcome to the Let's Imagine podcast.
Hello, Bruce. I am so delighted to join you today. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. So let's start with a really high-level view. Businesses have gone through so much change in the last few years. As I've mentioned, inflation, supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and now a higher interest environment. And layered on top of that is the increased geopolitical and trade uncertainty, including questions about the Canada-U.S Mexico free trade agreement. From your perspective, how would you describe the current state of the Canadian economy and how are businesses adapting to this new reality?
Well, that is a good place to start. How would you describe the current state of the Canadian economy? It's so interesting because there's, I wouldn't say confusion, Bruce, but I would say a discomfort because when you look at some of the numbers, so yes, we're experiencing slow growth or Canada is, below our potential growth. But really, when you think about it, it could look a whole lot worse, right? We could be in a really worse off situation. So there's kind of this dynamic of, well, things aren't that bad, yet I think businesses and everyday Canadians together remain highly uncomfortable and not in a good place when we think about how are we doing. So the way I like to talk about this, almost that dissonance in that, like what the data actually says and that it could be worse, but compare that to how we're feeling, is that you have to think about it as, are you looking out the windshield or the rear view mirror? Because when you glance in the rearview mirror, of course, it could be a whole lot worse. And yes, we're still growing even at a slower rate, but how long can our consumer spending resilience hang on and hang in there? And you're looking out that windshield. If you're a business, you can't see very clearly. You can't see very far at all. And everybody knows whether you've been driving through a blizzard or a snowstorm or just a bad rainstorm, when you can't see, and you're hugging the line, and you have to keep moving, it is incredibly uncomfortable. So hard to take decisions, so hard to feel good about where you're headed and what that journey's like. So that's how I like to describe that kind of experience we're having based on when we look ahead versus when we kind of take a look back at our quarterly numbers.
So I'm going to stay with your windshield metaphor for a minute here. So if you're looking through that windshield and it's a snowstorm or driving rain or fog, to a certain degree, that helps you navigate the speed that you go at, how confident you feel as a driver in terms of navigating the terrain. So as you think about both consumer and investor confidence right now. What are the kinds of things that you're hearing from members of the chamber?
Yeah. Well, just as a reminder, our members are from Main Street to Bay Street. So through our corporate members and associations and network of chambers and boards of trade, that's nearly 200,000 businesses in the country, from even micro businesses to your multinationals is another way to look at that. So it can be very different depending on which sector you're in, because we know we have tariffs impacting certain sectors more acutely. But maybe I will talk about, just the sizes of businesses. So of course, if you're the larger business, you're much more able to absorb some of these shocks and impacts from the uncertainty and tariffs. You might be delaying big decisions and those capital outlays or the investments you're making. So they might be happening at a slower pace or just being put off. But if you're a micro business or a small business, it's really hard to absorb those impacts. So you might just be choosing to shut the doors. And that, of course, is very concerning. And I don't think we see that. We try to bring those stories to the forefront and look at that data as best we can on aggregate. But that is, in fact, happening. Or some of those businesses are saying, yes, I understand I need to and should diversify trade out of the one market of the U.S. where they may just be exporting to in isolation right now. But they don't have the capacity to take that on. So they might be deciding to shut their doors, unfortunately.
Yeah, and hopefully that won't be the case, because so many Canadians rely on all different levels, small, medium, large companies, to be able to, feed their families and pay their mortgages and their rent. So fingers crossed that the front windshield looks cleaner and that people are moving forward with more confidence. But this is kind of a nice segue then into the connection between the sectors, because, corporate community investment and giving at the community level has always fluctuated with economic cycles. But we are starting to see some deeper shifts, including rising expectations around environmental and social responsibility, purpose-driven branding, and new ways companies think about their roles in community well-being. So from the vantage point that you hold, what trends are you seeing in how companies are redefining community investment or social impact right now?
Yeah, I think there are some very interesting trends. And I always viewed it because I led stakeholder relations and community investment for a large private sector company. That was part of my journey, is understanding what those trends are and what those shifts are. And I got really excited about it, Bruce, because, when we think about the way corporate social responsibility maybe came to be, or philanthropy first, right? Philanthropy of just give back, right? You're doing well, so give back. And corporate social responsibility started to, become a bit more strategic than that. But my most exciting part of that journey was shifting into the realm of impact investing. And because I led ESG efforts, I saw such a good, shift, synergy, uptake, new energy into the entire space, because it made a lot of sense to me to work with my company and say, okay, what is most material? Because we don't exist independent of the community and the stakeholders in which we operate. So what's most material when you look at those relationships and you look at the community? What's most material to our business? So that could be the talent pipeline. So that might lead you to investing heavily in education or the programs that keep kids in school and interested in the programs that feed the types of skill sets you need in your workforce. So it becomes very much more of that partnership. So you make those investments that are material mostly to your purpose as an organization, and you find which partners then best help you execute on that. And so those investments then have a really different feel to them than just we're doing the right thing as a company, to we're actually partnered and in making those investments that have a return that benefits both parties. And I think that's a bit of a game changer when it really becomes measurable and almost uses the skills that business is used to in impact investing or social impact investing. Because then I think the partnership in the long term between business and community is really well grounded.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. And for me, as you think about impact investing, that was and has been and continues to be, sort of at the forefront of innovative ways of thinking about how companies and causes can engage. I want to maybe just bridge a little bit into the area of innovation, because I think at the heart of what we're seeing of the repositioning of our economy, not just finding partners other than the United States, or in addition, it's probably a better way of saying it, to the United States, is also thinking about how the innovation agenda is being driven here in Canada. From your lens, how are you seeing that conversation unfold with business? Are they starting to really get behind ensuring that Canada is a leader in innovation in this country? And, we're going to talk about digital in a minute, but I imagine that sort of plays into it. But I'm just curious as to your take on where innovation is situated in the business conversation now.
Well, it's highly significant. And there's lots of things I could go into in terms of Canada's, I think we have a lot of interest in innovation, but we might struggle on execution and our entrepreneurialism, or have more startups, but not a lot of scale ups. And that's multifaceted. But Bruce, I think if I could share, something I've been thinking about lately is, where does even innovation fit in the organizations that are nonprofits, and how are we, and I lead a nonprofit as the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm trying to stretch my own thinking in how do I bring the innovation mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset to the nonprofit I lead, and think of myself as maybe using those skills more than I think I would have thought coming into this role. And I think that's a really interesting space, and probably one you and I should talk more about over coffee sometime, of what are you seeing in terms of that muscle, that innovation, that entrepreneurial muscle, because we have to work on that in business. But I think we underestimate, I think actually the only difference between business and some nonprofits is what you do with your surplus. And does it go to shareholders, or do you reinvest it in purpose and impact? And therefore, I think the innovation conversation, not just startup, but how to scale up, how to use your entrepreneurial muscles, applies right across all kinds of organizations and companies, including our nonprofits. I'm not sure, maybe you have some thoughts to add on that one.
It's funny, and absolutely, I agree with you. I think this is an area that we're seeing more organizations talk about, and at times, unfortunately, are forced to talk about. So if we think about an economic period, and you can even go back as far as the start of the pandemic, where demand for services from charities and nonprofits has outstripped supply of resources, then organizations are required to think differently. And so there is an opportunity here actually to reimagine many of the workflows, service orientations, and even business models. I would say in the last 6 months, I've heard more conversations around strategic partnerships, alliances, and even as far as, dare I say, mergers or potentially acquisitions, where organizational leaders are thinking about the continuation of services rather than continuation of existing business models. So I think it's very much part of the conversation for organizational leaders. The one other thing that we're hearing a lot about on our sector, obviously, is digital transformation, because it is really reshaping the way that organizations operate. And it's also a reality that both businesses and nonprofits are being, pushed to adapt to. Although sometimes with different levels of resources. Where are you seeing the most significant shifts in digital innovation, and how are these changes influencing the way business is conducted? And what do you think that might mean for community engagement?
Yeah, well, that is the question. I'll share a couple thoughts, because the most important thing to digest around this question about the answer is we actually don't know yet. We want to know desperately because we need the certainty. But when you think about the transition we're in the process of figuring out, okay, what does AI mean? How might I use it? How do I think through not just this is an automatic adoption and everything's automated, but what's the type of work? What's the type of value I add where I would want to protect it from AI and digital transformation? And where would I augment? And then what makes sense to completely transform and automate? But the reason we don't know where this is going, when you look ahead, whether it's 10 years down the road, even the forecasted range of how many humanoids or robots we'll have with us is like a very wide range, like, an estimate with billions in between. So we don't know. There's so many possibilities. Or when you think about the implications of everything we're talking about today in terms of this transformation is about our language models, but we're switching to world models, and which is a completely different terrain. And I don't even know how to digest that. So the only thing I am comfortable in is saying and reassuring people we actually don't know yet. But again, to do two things: realize it's not an automatic handover, that we have the agency to protect what we want not to have touched by AI and digitization, and to augment in certain places and not just automate. I would say, and this comes back to your question before this one, we do need to challenge ourselves, however, if we want to be dedicated and have good muscle and innovation, challenge ourselves to break up with the present. And that's not easy to do, right? I think we're wired to sort of hang on and conserve and preserve. But if you actually want to entertain, where could this go? We have to go through those exercises, those visioning exercises where we assume nothing of what we know and nothing of how we do things today is there anymore. And that forces you to imagine possibilities, but also pragmatically engage in what might become our reality. And at least that gives us a bit of a pathway to follow so we can shape those outcomes and not just be recipients in where AI and digital transformation takes us.
Yeah, that's so interesting because to a certain degree, that's going to be a period of a lot of discomfort, I think, as people now start to get into the messiness of what that change might look like. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, as you're aware, at Imagine Canada, we have the Prism Company Network and a framework that looks at how companies and nonprofits can build stronger, more strategic partnerships. So as we go into this period of where we're reflecting and thinking about what the future looks like, why do you think it's valuable for businesses to maintain and invest in these partnerships, even during periods of economic pressure, growing uncertainty, or really this sort of general fuzziness that we seem to be living in right now?
Well, the general fuzziness we're living in right now, I think, really challenges us to think differently. So I'll answer your question maybe in a bit of a different way. Why is it so important we maintain these partnerships? It's actually because we need to think differently about the entire economy. Because as we started out talking about, the micro businesses and small and medium-sized enterprise right up to multinationals, that's all part of the economy. And I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of it just the same, is I separate business for profit from business and organization for impact. But I think this is something I'm just working through right now, is how does that whole ecosystem work together? So where I'm going with this is, rather than Bruce thinking about business has to work with charity and nonprofit and make sure that link is there because it matters and so it is so important, I actually think about it today in terms of, can we get to a place where we're not thinking it's us and them, right? It's business and then the rest of, like the charitable sector. It's actually all part of the same ecosystem. What we do with the revenues we raise to have impact might look different, but how are we just partnering to get what we need to get done together? And that's the whole of a business and economy that functions for the benefit of those it serves, the broader society. And so therefore, the partnership is inherent to that. So it just falls apart if you ignore the partnership. But I think the magic of it is actually seeing the partnership in that broadest sense of how all organizations, all companies, whether you're for profit or, turning any profits back into impact, it just has to work together from a systems perspective. And I think there's, again, I should probably have coffee and we can talk some of this through, is I think there's some other places in the world where they look at social enterprises with a bit of a different lens, or they look at community interest groups as companies, as business, just with a different lens. And I think that's a neat thing to explore if we're going to, challenge ourselves to be innovative and maybe break up with the present, I think that reinvention of ourselves is worth looking at, because at the end of the day, this all has to work in a system that serves and meets the needs of society.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's so interesting. So I think we do have a coffee chat coming up, but it's interesting because I'm actually going later this spring to speak to one of your member organizations. And one of the first things I'll be doing is actually going and looking to see how does that particular chamber reflect the connection between its traditional business interests and the whole community. Because I would argue that if communities are trying to attract investment and new business, that those investors are first and foremost people. And if they're looking to bring employees into that marketplace, they want to know about education and healthcare and mental health services and protection of the environment and sport and recreation and arts and culture, which is essentially our sector. And how can we actually work together to attract the investment? To your point, it's a healthy then system that supports each other. So I'll be curious to see what they have as I go looking in preparation for the presentation. But I think it is really incumbent on us to be mindful of how these systems can support each other. So, we've been talking about a little bit about uncertainty and fuzziness and what's coming. So, a lot of organizations are kind of wondering what's next. Will corporate community investment rebound? Will sponsorships look different? Will companies shift more towards partnership-based social impact work? So, as businesses adapt their strategies for this kind of increasingly uncertain economic and trade environment, what counsel or advice would you have for our members as to the top-line indicators that nonprofit leaders should be looking for that might affect the overall health and well-being of the business sector, and therefore the knock-on effect to corporate community investment work?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. The first is, given the level of uncertainty, I think some understanding of some of those good partners just might be on pause or a little bit hesitant to make big commitments. I say until this blows over, which it won't. This is a bit of a permanent, or at least permanent in terms of it's we're going through something to something new. That's definite, right? So I think being good partners in that journey, a little bit of patience, but then really leaning into what we talked about is like, what is most material for the business? What are those needs that intersect in terms of the purpose of one organization and the needs of that partner business that might want and be ready to make some of those investments? Because being really good at articulating that through a good partnership discussion and process, that was my experience. And it really did change things, as opposed to a conversation being, here are our needs, we're hoping you can support us. Really flipping that script and those partnership conversations being, what are your business priorities? And we're looking for the intersections here where that lines up with our purpose and perhaps some investments that bring a return for your business. And it did. It changed the game in such an interesting and neat way, and how we reported on our investments. Like, it was exciting for the company and business, because we like to say we've made these investments and here's the impact that's having, right? And so I would say leaning into that, just with the caveat that it might take a bit of patience, given this is still a very, very highly bumpy year of 2026. So, but I do have faith in that framework and that model, because that was my experience.
Well, that actually sets up our last question very nicely. So despite all this turbulence, the bumps in the road, we are seeing innovation on both the nonprofit and for-profit side. We're seeing new models of partnership and fresh thinking about the role of business in society. So as you look ahead, what gives you hope about the future of the Canadian economy and hope about the future of business and nonprofit collaboration?
Well, I think there's three things. The first is what you were talking about, going to speak to one of our members, our chambers. When you get to the on the ground level, like that localization, I think the coming together of the ecosystem we talked about today is more apparent than at the national level. But that's what we're trying to recreate on the national level, is that clarity. And that's our strategy. And that's the second thing that gives me hope and optimism. The strategy right now of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is not just to build business, but to be nation builders and community builders. So realizing how that whole ecosystem has to come together, where business and economy serve society, and us leaning into that with our leadership. And the third thing, the last thing, is that if we know we have to make change, because you've seen the evolution and this change has been happening regardless of the headwinds we're experiencing now, but sometimes uncertainty helps unfreeze things, which provides a lot of opportunity and possibility to build new. And so we can never forget, as we're tackling adversity and perhaps frustrated and digging deep, that the opportunity that all opens up can be really, really exciting. And I am really excited about that for Canada, for the businesses in Canada, for everyday Canadians and the communities they live in.
That's a great way to end off. Candace, thank you so much for taking time to join us on Let's Imagine here today.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.